Hello, welcome to the lecture on physical and cognitive maturation. Just so you know, the reading that goes along with today's lecture besides the chapter in your book is actually an NPR episode from This American Life on testosterone. And when we get back next week, I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about this because I think the radio show is kind of provocative in its exploration of testosterone and the effects of testosterone. So if you want to take a second and pause the video and jot some of these questions down, you might think about them while you're listening to the show. And when we come back next week, we'll talk about these in class. Okay, on to the lecture. So when we're talking about maturation for humans, it really involves both physical maturation and cognitive maturation. And when we talk about physical maturation, we're talking about the completion of growth, both in height and strength. So not only do humans get taller as they reach adulthood, but they also tend to build muscle differently and get stronger. And we're also talking about reproductive maturity. And this is primarily the criteria that biologists use when they're discussing whether an animal is an adult or not, is whether they're reproductively active. And this means that they're fertile, they're either producing eggs or sperm, or they show secondary sexual characteristics, like particular characteristics that indicate female or male. And these are the characteristics that come during the onset of puberty. We could also talk about cognitive maturation in terms of brain development, and behavioral maturity. So adult animals tend to behave differently than juveniles and infants, and this is definitely true of humans also. So at the end of the lecture, we'll talk about some behaviors that are indicative of passing on to maturation, and we'll discuss some evolutionary questions of why we might see these behaviors. So with age, we definitely see a change in mental and physical development. So you can see these boys here, age 6 through 12 at 2-year intervals. And you can see the difference in head size to arm length. Little Chinana there on the right in the non-school uniform can just barely get his arm over his head, and the boy on the left has no problem getting his hand all the way down to his chin. So it's not just height, it's also things like limb length and head size compared to body size, and we discussed that in the lecture on childhood. Another thing that occurs with age is where you are and what you're doing, and I call this situational learning. So little Chinana doesn't play in the forest much. He mostly sticks around home, and he started going to school this year. The other boys will have much more freedom in terms of where they spend their day, and as they get older, they'll also begin accompanying other adults into the forest, and I was studying honey collection in this case, so they'll start engaging in some situational learning relative to honey collection. And there's also historical processes, and in this case that involves both things that you've learned previously and experiences that you've had. So as you age, the things that you've done earlier in life affect what opportunities are available to you later in life. So with honey collecting, I learned that most people, if they hadn't learned to climb trees by their mid-20s, they never learned to climb trees. And so what they had done in their youth affected their behavior as adults. And that was the subject of my dissertation, actually, and I'd love to talk about it more in depth if you're interested, but it was discussing learning across the life cycle. So this is the acquisition of honey collecting knowledge. So I basically gave people a honey collecting quiz, and their score out of 14 points reflects how well they answered questions about honey collecting. This could be things like, what food do the bees like to eat, and stuff like that. And by age. And we see here that for the male curve, the solid line on top, a lot of learning occurs by the age of 20. And we definitely see, especially since the age of 6, this spike in learning that occurs, especially once the kids hit puberty. And a lot changes in terms of cognitive abilities, in terms of observation and memory, and also physical abilities. As these boys hit 20, they're tall enough, they're strong enough to start climbing the really big trees and going with the adults to collect honey from the large and dangerous. So maturation is both what's happening after puberty and as individuals become adults. What are the skills and knowledge that they need to know to be adults in their society? Another thing that I found that changes with age, just because I love to talk about my dissertation, is that demonstrator quality changes over the life cycle. So now put yourself in the shoes of someone who wants to learn something like tree climbing. Well, this is a graph of tree climbing by age and ability, and you can see that the guys who are in their 20s are the best tree climbers. To the left of the line, they were climbing a different tree, so it was much easier. To the right of the dashed line, it was the people who were considered adults after age of 16, and they were climbing a much more difficult tree. So it's good to know what other adults in your society need to do, and also who you should learn from. So maturation really starts with puberty. And at puberty, we look at the physiological, morphological, and behavioral changes that lead to reproductive maturity. This really is a time of transition, especially for humans from the juvenile phase to the adult phase, and we consider this adolescence. So at puberty, you become reproductively active, but you might not be reproductively capable. What does this mean? Maybe you're not capable of finding mates or attracting mates, or maybe you don't have the skills necessary to successfully raise offspring yet. So puberty is really a process, and for girls and boys it lasts about 8 years. In girls, we consider puberty to start around 10 and go until age 18. And for boys, this is about a 2-year delay, which is so apparent in pretty much every junior high school dance photo. And it's not just behavioral. Obviously, there's a lot of physiological changes that are going on also. And besides reaching adult height and weight and musculature, we refer to secondary sexual characteristics that appear at the onset of puberty. So for females, this includes breast development, the hips widen, and we also see fat deposition in certain areas like the hips and the butt. For males, this mostly includes changes in facial structure, changes in hair, and also along the face and along the chest. We see for both sexes also increased activity of sweat glands, so a lot of parents have to start pressuring their children to shower after puberty. And for males, this also includes a growth of the vocal cords. And there's also during this time changes in skin, which is why teenagers tend to have acne problems, and different types of axillary and pubic hair appear as well. So let's talk about each sex kind of more specifically. For maturation from being a girl to being a woman, as I said, this starts about 10 years old. And at this time we start seeing breast development and fat depositions occurring. Once enough fat has been accumulated to theoretically sustain a pregnancy, then we see the onset of menarche. And this occurs on average between 12 and 13 years, although the average is decreasing with amount of development. In some societies, menarche can be as late as 15 to 16 years. It really is dependent on the nutritional status of the population. And then generally we see full physical development by 15 to 17 years for girls. So at this point, adult height has been reached, and we see what we would consider a more womanly figure with developed breasts and this hourglass shape. What proximate mechanisms are mediating this change is mostly due to levels of estrogen. And estrogen is involved in widening the pelvis. It also promotes the growth of the uterus to be able to sustain a pregnancy. And it's produced by the ovaries, which affects the liver, adrenal glands, breast, and fat cells. Now, a quick search on Wikipedia, not the most reliable source, but one source, reveals all of the different mechanisms and structures that estrogen relates to. So it decelerates growth, which makes sense because as you reach puberty, or as you finish puberty, your growth stops. It increases uterine growth and thickens the vaginal wall. It's involved with bone resorption of calcium, other morphic changes. It does protein synthesis. It's involved with the coagulation of blood. It's involved with fats like cholesterol and other types of fat deposition. It's involved with sodium and water retention, melanin, cancer, lung functions. Many jobs does estrogen, as most hormones do. But for our purposes, we're mostly concerned with menarche, which is the onset of menstruation. And as I said, the onset of menstruation has been declining recently from, in Norway at least, 18 years old in the 1840s to, this data only goes up to the 1960s, but you can see for Norway that's decreased to 14 years old. And that's mostly involved in the nutritional status. So as we said, lipids are involved with estrogen production, and they're one of the things that mediate this onset of menstruation, menarche. by triggering the ovaries to begin developing follicles and triggering the development of the uterus and the vaginal wall. Now, even though these systems are coming online, a female, once she's reached menarche, might not be able to sustain a pregnancy for another couple of years. Egg production might be unreliable for a little while, but there is, as we've said for everything that we talk about in this class, there is a lot of variation in the speed of development, the timing of the onset of menarche, and the timing of the first birth. And we know that some girls can become pregnant at ages 9 or 10 in developed countries. So, what are the secondary sexual characteristics that are reflective of female adulthood? And mostly this involves fat deposition, so fat in the hips, the thighs, the buttocks, and the breasts, and we would call this estrogenic fat. And the fat distribution creates what we refer to typically as this hourglass figure, but really, at least in scientific terms, we call it the waist-to-hip ratio. And the waist-to-hip ratio, as you can see on the cartoons here, for women is different than for men. Because fat depositions are made on the hips and the butt, we see a narrower waist compared to the hips. And it's hypothesized that this is an honest signal of physical preparation for childbirth. So women wishing to attract mates, if they display enough estrogenic fat to be able to sustain a pregnancy, this should theoretically be attractive to males because they know that spending their time trying to attract a mate and get her to mate with him is going to pay out theoretically in the long run because she is actually capable of reproducing. Cross-culturally, there's been some evidence that a waist-hip ratio of about 0.7, so a waist that's 70% the width of the hips, is kind of generically attractive to humans around the world. However, there are notable exceptions, especially in cultures where fatter is better. More body fat means more attractive. So let's talk about physical maturation of boys to men. Yes, classic band group from my youth. Puberty for boys starts at around 12 years old, and full fertility is usually reached at about 14 to 16 when sperm production is reliable enough to be able to pregnate a partner. And full physical development doesn't occur until 17 to 19 years old. Now, a lot of scientists have debated why males going through puberty at around 14 to 16 should be reproductively capable, but not take on the adult phenotype or the secondary sexual characteristics of males. And one hypothesis is that because these young males would not be able of competing with the older males for mates, especially physically, it gives them an edge in terms of sneak fertilization. So it's kind of a signal that says, hey, I'm not a threat, when in actuality these males might be able to pregnate potential partners. But we can definitely see this difference in physical development, as I said, with my tree climbing data. And we really see here that it's not until their late teens and early 20s that these men are capable of climbing the really difficult trees. And here's Mutumani. He was our best tree climber. He got up to this branch. It's about 60 feet in the air. He got up and down in less than a minute. It was incredible. And you can see there's no branches, and that bark is very smooth. So quite a feat of climbing here, and he's 23. And among the Jinnah in South India, these the males don't start collecting from the giant Asian honeybees, as I said, until about 18, because they just don't have that full physique. Their arms aren't long enough, and they don't have the adult musculature. So what's moderating the maturation in males? Well, the main hormone here is testosterone, and testosterone is involved with the development of the testes for sperm production and the prostate. It's also involved with sexual dimorphism and the onset of these adult male characteristics. All vertebrates except fish have some sort of testosterone, and just like estrogen, it's a biological multitasker. It does a lot of different activities. And we already talked about spermarchy in here, but testosterone is involved with not just the generation of the testicles and during infancy, but also triggering the testicles to begin producing sperm. And if you want to stop here and take a look at this picture and look at the cascade of all the different hormones that are involved with sperm production, you're welcome to. So the secondary sexual characteristics that we see at the onset of male adulthood is an increase in size and mass of muscles, a lengthening of the vocal cord and the bones, and an increase in facial and body hair. And what this results in is a deeper voice. The vocal cords get longer, the wavelength of pitch production gets longer, and the tone drops. The lengthening of the bones is involved with generating characteristics like a square jaw, also larger brow ridges, and the end of that growth spurt as males reach adulthood. Increased musculature results in broad shoulders, and then also, of course, facial and body hair appears as secondary sexual characteristics in males, so mostly beards and chest hair, essentially. Now, as we'll read an article later on, and as I've been alluding to this whole time, testosterone actually is quite a handicap. It weakens the immune system, it suppresses the immune system, and we know this experimentally, and there's a lot of evidence that says more boys are more likely to die at every age, especially early ages, and human sex ratios reflect this. So more boys are conceived and born than girls. So worldwide, 104 boys are born for every 100 girls. And this tends to even out by about 5 years of age because more male fetuses are terminated early on, and more male babies are more likely to die by the age of 5 years old. They have a weaker immune system, and that's primarily the effect at this age. As males age, testosterone negatively affects them in other ways, mostly with risk-taking and aggression, so doing risky things that end up in injury and death, and getting in conflicts with other males that also end up in injury and death. Now, one hypothesis is why display these secondary sexual characteristics, both physiologically and behaviorally, and some researchers think it's due to Cauchy signaling. So let's walk this through with the immune system example. Decreasing immune system function by having testosterone could result in things like physical deformities. If you were able to sustain the handicap of high levels of testosterone and display a square jaw, large shoulders, lots of facial hair, and still remain healthy and active and mating, then it could be a signal that the male has good genes, good enough genes that their immune system can handle whatever's thrown at it, even despite the weakening effects of testosterone. So I'm happy to talk more about that in detail later if you want. So to sum up what is going on with maturity, well, it's the completion of physical growth. Individuals have become sexually active and fertile, and they've also been socially recognized as an adult. So let's just talk about sexual dimorphism, the differences in males and females after maturation. Males tend to have more body mass, so about 1.5 times lean body mass, muscles, that kind of thing. Males also tend to have 1.5 times the skeletal mass of females. Females, on the other hand, have twice as much body fat. And the first time I taught this class, so it gives you an idea of how long I've been teaching for, in my class at UC Davis in California, the males on average, this was a freshman class, it was a slightly different version, were 5'10" and weighed 171 pounds, and the females were on average 5'4" and weighed 134 pounds. But this idea of, I want to go back to this idea of biological versus social adulthood. And this was reflected in our ideas of sex versus gender. And so I wanted to address this specifically quickly. So sex is a biological concept often determined by, do you have a Y chromosome, or are you displaying secondary sexual characteristics, or even primary sexual characteristics like the existence of testes or ovaries. So it's genetically determined and physiologically constrained. Gender, on the other hand, is a cultural concept, and these are both pictures of the same person, RuPaul. So what makes someone male or female might be considered sex, and what makes someone a man or a woman is determined culturally. So how you dress, hairstyles, ideas of femininity and masculinity. And these ideas are very socially determined. So if you know the history of the high-heeled shoe in Europe, men started wearing high heels before women, and then eventually this fashion was co-opted by women, and now men no longer desire to wear high-heeled shoes. So the fact that women wear heels and men don't, this is very socially determined cultural concept of what is feminine. And we discussed a little bit about what creates sex in the womb. And we discussed genetic classification and sex differentiation disorders. Here's just a comic of Calvin and Hobbes. And a lot of people say, oh, boys will be boys, and there are behavioral differences. But many of these behavioral differences are culturally mediated. And we do have a lot of examples where we can't place people in one category or the other, or we have conflicting ideas of what it means to be male or female. So one thing that we talked about was insensitivity to testosterone, where you have the Y chromosome and you're producing testosterone, but you don't have the receivers, so you don't develop the male reproductive tract, and you won't develop the male secondary sexual characteristics. And so it's quite a complex idea between genes, chemicals, sex, and then also gender. So this is Sandra John. She won the silver medal, I think, for sprinting in 2006, but it turned out that she has testosterone insensitivity disorder, and she's actually an XY, and so the Olympic Committee decided to revoke her medal because they ended up classifying her as male. Now, this is a very controversial decision, and the Olympic committees are going to be faced with more of these decisions in the future, certainly. In Atlanta in 1996, they tested 3,387 females, and out of them, 8 were actually had a Y chromosome. So, we can definitely designate people as one sex or the other, one gender or the other, but it's a very imperfect method of determining, essentially whether you're male or female or a man or a woman. Okay, so back to lecture, or back to the stuff. So adolescence is this time period where, at least in humans, we have reproductively active individuals. So think like potentially 14-year-old boy, 13-year-old girl. And they're biologically maybe considered adults because they're reproductively active. But, especially in our culture, they're still considered far from being social adults. And you can tell that from this Time magazine that, children having children. A biologist might, if we were considering, a primiparous macaque mother who is very young, we would consider her as being an adult because she's reproductively active, even though she might not necessarily have finished her growth period. And among humans, we would not consider this individual as being an adult. So we separate physical maturity from social maturity. And in the US, at least, it seems like adolescence is getting to be a longer and longer period as you have to go through college and then maybe even grad school or some sort of training period. And then what really is considered social maturity? Is it getting married? Is it owning property? Is it being financially independent? So social maturity is really determined by other members of the society, whether they recognize you as an adult or not. Among the Genochruba, most people were recognized as an adult somewhere between the age of 16 and 20. And at this time period, you have certain responsibilities that you are expected to cover, as well as certain privileges, like you are allowed to get married, vote, make important decisions in your own life. Physical maturity, we generally consider to be when growth ends, when you're sexually active and fertile, so menarche or spermarchy is occurring. And we see this shift from emphasis on growth to emphasis on reproductive effort. So what are people getting better at cognitively during this period? This gives us a lot of clues to what's going on, or what has been going on through the evolution of humans and adolescents. During this time, people are getting much better at their interpersonal relations, so handling emotions, making decisions in the face of emotions, becoming political, dealing with relationships with other members in the community. And they also get better at processing the relevant information to their society. And we see shifts in brain matter in teenagers. So this is the use it or lose it philosophy. Gray matter peaks at the onset of puberty and decreases slightly afterwards. So what we're seeing here is actually a synaptic pruning that facilitates the connections that are used often and disconnects those are not. And so we see a lot of sensitive periods and being able to learn ending around or shortly after the completion of puberty, because synaptic pruning occurs during this time and you're kind of canalizing the connections in the brain, both to make it more efficient and also limiting the connections that could be made further. So a lot of people I know wish they said, oh, I could have been an Olympic ice skater if my mom had started me when I'm 3 versus, when I'm 17 or something. There is an element that after puberty, you do learn things differently. And here's just an example of the shift in gray matter volume between being 5 years old and 20 years old. And here's another graph showing the difference in gray matter. So it peaks in boys around 13 and in girls around 11. And white matter, these connections, continues to increase. And we really do see a difference in processing emotions across teenagers. So younger teens are really bad at identifying their emotions, and they're primarily using the amygdala in the closer to the brainstem, the more reptilian part of the brain that processes gut reactions. So they might feel major emotions like anger, disgust, happiness. But as people become older teens and approach adulthood, they both improve their cognitive performance as activity switches to the prefrontal cortex, especially for identifying emotions. So we see this emotional processing moving from the back of the brain, near the brainstem, to the prefrontal cortex in the front of the brain. And this parallels the change in white matter. So people are actually much better at decision making and emotional processing as they move through puberty and approach adulthood. And during this time, we also see a lot of mental disorders appearing because we see things going wrong in the organization of the brain during this process. So it's really indicative that this is when we'd expect to see the onset of mental disorders. Issues with anxiety, depression, and substance abuse often surface during these ages. Also, a lot of mental disorders show an onset, such as schizophrenia, shortly after puberty. So now we can ask a couple of evolutionary questions about things that are going on during adolescence. So why are teens more likely to take risks? As Helen Keller says, life is either a daring adventure or nothing. We do see an increased amount of risk-taking in teenagers. And this is seen in all mammals. And our best hypothesis is that it's tied to the timing of dispersal. So depending on the mating system in the group, either males or females or both have to leave at some point. Otherwise, you're left with only your siblings and close relatives for mates. So being a risk taker around or after, shortly after social and physical and reproductive maturation will prime animals to disperse from the group, head out on their own, away from the safety of the individuals they're used to and the environment they know, and move into a new area and a new social group. And we see differences in impulse control and behavioral regulation maturing into early adulthood. So if you've been a young male applying for car insurance, you know that it costs a lot more than before the age of 25 than after the age of 25, because the adjusters have done a lot of research in rate of accidents. And it's not just, that these young men are less capable at driving because they've had less experience, but they're also more likely to take risks. The other hypothesis is that during this time, risk-taking might be tied to reputation. We definitely see an increase in risk-taking in the presence of peers, also in the presence of opposite-sexed individuals. So it might be that individuals are trying to display feats of strength or daring in order to increase reputation and social standing in the group, which definitely translates down the line to better access to resources and mates. So some data displaying this comes from our discounting the future method, which measures risk-taking. So when the future seems uncertain, you should take what you can today. So if you are riskier, we'd expect people to prefer rewards that are closer to the current time period than further in the future. So here's the trade-off. I could ask you the question, would you rather have $5 today? So I will meet you anywhere in town you want and I will give you $5. Or in 120 days from now, I will meet you anywhere in town you want and give you $6. What would you prefer? Then I can ask you the same thing. Would you rather have $6 today or $12 in 120 days? Would you rather have $10 today or $50 in 120 days? Or would you rather have $20 and $200 in 120 days? And you might prefer $5 today versus $6 later, but by the time we get to the bottom, you'd probably prefer the $200 later than the $20 today. And where you make this shift reflects how much you discount the future. So if you really think the future is never going to happen, or you have a disease that you know, or you have a mark on your head and you're going to get assassinated in 2 weeks or something, you should take the money today and use it. But if you think the future is really certain, then you should take the future reward. And we see these differences across ages. So just worry about the solid line and the long dashed line at the bottom. The solid line is females, the long dashed line is males, and we definitely can see, the solid line is males and the long dashed line is females. Males are more likely to take risks, and this also peaks around the age of 40 as people begin to approach old age. They're less likely to think that the future occurs. So it's probably involved with both reputation, dispersal, mate choice, and also age. So another mystery of our youth that a lot of people like to talk about is peer pressure. As Nietzsche says, the surest way to corrupt a youth is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently. Now, I think most teenagers don't need instruction in this to hold in higher esteem those who think alike. But also, for you Bruce Lee fans out there, as many people reach adulthood. And we can also look at this quote here from Bruce Lee: "I'm not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you're not to live in this world to live up to mine." Now, many adults state this and many teenagers try to emulate it, but it's definitely much more difficult for teenagers to follow this advice. And it's probably due to effects of social learning. So as we said in our last lecture, culture is so adaptive. Most of childhood is devoted to learning social and cultural norms and skills for survival and mating and those kinds of things. And so adolescents are very capable of learning adult skills and knowledge, but learning is also very costly in terms of time and energy, cost of failure. So if I put you out in the forest and ask you to go mushroom hunting, I think you'd much prefer to learn from somebody else than try it on your own. So one way to assess which skills and knowledge are more important to spend your time learning is to conform to what other people do. So it's kind of unsurprising that as people are approaching adulthood, they're spending a lot of time on conformist bias learning, trying to acquire the social norms and the average cultural traits in their society. Now, there's definitely other social learning processes going on during this time. It's just a time when conformity bias learning is more important than other parts of the life cycle. Another very important aspect for many cultures during adolescence are rites of passage. And rites of passage are associated with transitions between life stages. In this sense, it's very important to transition from being a juvenile and an adolescent to a fully adult member of a society with specific responsibilities and privileges. And so there are many rituals associated with the puberty stage of the life cycle across human cultures, both for females and for males. And until people go through these rites of passages, they're not recognized adults. And here again is that difference between social maturity and biological maturity for humans. And during these rites of passages, there's often what we call a liminal stage, and this is while you're going through the rite of passage. You're neither adolescent nor adult, you're in the process of making the transition, and that's called liminal. And during this period, oftentimes groups of males or females who are going through the rite of passage are treated as egalitarian within the group. They will tend to have a communal ideology and very important social relations. So just here's some examples of rites of passage, both feats of strength and tests of manhood. On the left, joining a fraternity and going through hazing, perhaps in the center, and boot camp and acquiring the fully adult status within the Army between recruit and member. So why have puberty rites of passage? And here's just some more examples of rites around the world. Well, we could give our 4 levels of explanation. Our approximate level, it's a cultural norm. So we've always done this. It's a reason to celebrate. This person is approaching puberty, and it's just what we do at this time. A developmental explanation might be that it marks a major change in physical development. So they're at the stage of the life cycle where the onset of fertility and responsibilities and privileges are important. And so because they're at this age in this developmental stage, then they go through the rite of passage. We can also give ultimate reasons. So at this point, we see with the onset of social adulthood, the individual now has access to mates. They have a different status, higher mate value, and oftentimes they're left with visible signals, cultural markers of adulthood that signal I'm ready to mate and form relationship and bonds. So there's an increase in reproductive success by marking who's fully adult and who's not, who's readily available as a mate. And also once you go through that, you increase your status and your mate value and potentially can get higher quality mates for yourself. And finally, phylogenetic, we can talk about humans. Like other apes, although other apes don't have a childhood, they do have a long period of dependence on their mothers. So we have this long development period, which we inherited from some common ancestor, which perhaps makes reaching adulthood a momentous occasion. And if we wanted to have a synonym for a rite of passage in other ape species, it might be something like dispersal, when you have become biologically and socially an adult, and therefore it's time to leave your community and go out and find mates. So that's one way that we could apply the 4 levels of explanation to rites of passage. So I hope you enjoyed exploring some of these evolutionary questions and have perhaps learned a little bit more about your adolescence and approach to maturity. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in class next week, so please get in touch if you have any questions, and we can talk about testosterone then.